I was awakened by the ringing of the phone when morning had barely begun to break. I walked over to the receiver, and on the screen a familiar name appeared, my friend whom I hadn't seen for several months. He always showed up unexpectedly and immediately pulled me into the wildest adventures. When I heard the excitement in his voice, I knew this time would be something truly out of the ordinary. He explained that he had spotted a peculiar spot in satellite images of the Appalachian Mountains, a point that he claimed didn't match any geographic maps or known structures. Usually, he paid little attention to small anomalies, but now he was talking about something genuinely intriguing. I could hear that familiar mix of impatience and exhilaration in his tone. About an hour later, he was at my door. On the surface, he seemed in a good mood, but his eyes betrayed the endless torrent of thoughts swirling inside him. He was always bursting with ideas, especially when it came to mysterious places or territories hidden from human eyes. His backpack was stuffed with papers, maps, and some high-tech electronic equipment. Before I could ask any questions, he spread out printouts of satellite photos on the table and pointed to a tiny white dot amid a dense forest. From the description, it was located several kilometers from the nearest mountain trail. To an untrained eye, it could be anything, from an abandoned hunter's cabin to a topographical anomaly that the cameras had captured a little off. I was hooked by his explanation. He insisted that historical records showed no settlements there, no roads had ever been built, and civilization apparently hadn't reached that area in ages. He began listing possible theories. Maybe it was a cave, an entrance to an abandoned mine, or perhaps the remnants of ancient cult structures. He adored mysticism and everything shrouded in mystery. I recalled how, in his youth, he would organize homemade expeditions into deep caves, always talking about untouched corners of nature and seeking any excuse to venture out. I had accompanied him several times, though more often than not I simply watched him disappear into the darkness with his flashlight, determined to uncover the truth. My role was usually to secure his gear or rescue him from yet another crevasse. That's when we truly bonded, even though I never shared his fanatical passion for the mysterious. As I grew older, I settled into a steady job and gradually stopped venturing into nature. He, however, lived at his own pace, taking temporary jobs until he got tired and then slipping back underground into more adventures. Eventually, our meetings became rare, almost formal, but as soon as he discovered something new, he immediately thought of me. I seemed destined to be the reliable partner, calm under pressure, ready to help if things went awry. This time, the situation was similar. He showed me the photos and began explaining in detail that he wanted to plan a small expedition, 3 or 4 days long, a maximum of a week, if we stumbled upon any interesting sights. I hesitated internally, unsure if I was ready to spend a week of vacation on a strange trip deep into the forest. But at the same time, I realized that my everyday life felt stagnant. I had accumulated many unresolved feelings that needed an outlet. A mountain hike could be the perfect chance to hit the reset button, to break away from work and routine. I listened to his reasoning, rummaging in the depths of my soul for an excuse to say no, but found nothing convincing. Apparently sensing my readiness, he suddenly grew even more animated and even pulled out some papers from his backpack outlining routes with detailed day-by-day plans. He planned to start by ascending along one of the hunting trails, then veer off toward an overgrown logging road marked on the map as unmaintained. From there, he intended to venture deep into the forest to get closer to the mysterious spot that the satellite images had flagged as anomalous. He figured we'd spend a couple of days on the move, then a day or two scouting the area, and if we found nothing, we'd head back. I agreed, partly because it gave us a chance to spend time together and make up for lost time. It wasn't too hard to free myself for a few days from work. Besides, deep down I felt that a change of scenery wouldn't hurt. Lately, I often woke up feeling trapped in an endless cycle. Work, home, a brief, unsatisfying rest. Perhaps this trip with him would help me rediscover my zest for life. We decided not to delay our preparations and agreed to set off the very next day. He warned that only experienced hikers ventured into these parts since the forests were quite remote, and the terrain could be challenging. But that never stopped him. He was always ready to hoist his backpack and march toward the unknown, driven by pure curiosity. Many times we'd run out of water or had our gear break in the worst conditions. Yet he always managed to get out of any predicament. And despite my constant worries, I loved feeling part of these wild adventures. At dawn the next day, we began our preparations. I packed everything necessary: a sturdy backpack, sleeping bag, tent, a few days' worth of provisions, a first aid kit, flashlights, knives, and spare clothing. From past trips, I knew that an extra pair of socks and a small emergency kit were never a bad idea. My friend also brought an abundance of gear, including an axe, strong ropes, and of course maps he'd painstakingly retrieved from old archives. He meticulously cross-checked GPS coordinates with satellite images, marking out a proposed route and a backup plan in case the primary one proved impassable. Once everything was ready, we loaded our gear into the car and drove out of the small town where we lived. Our starting point wasn't far, about an hour's drive on the highway, then a short gravel road winding among the hills. Gradually, human structures disappeared from view, replaced by hills cloaked in thick forest. The asphalt gave way to a mix of stones and gravel, and soon we stopped at an almost imperceptible trail leading into a pine grove. We left the car at the very edge, making sure it wouldn't be a nuisance to the rare passers-by. The moment we stepped into the forest's cool shade, I was hit by a mix of emotions. On one hand, it felt wonderful to escape the bustle of civilization, to feel the soft carpet of fallen pine needles beneath my feet and hear the mighty trees whispering overhead. On the other, the deep semi-darkness and echoing silence stirred a vague unease, as if some unseen phenomenon might be lurking within the forest. There's an ancient, raw power in such places, a force unlike anything city dwellers are used to. It felt as though we had been transported centuries back to a time without roads, communication, or electricity. My friend kept scanning the surroundings. He examined rare tracks in the dirt, stopped to study a dragonfly that had landed on a blade of grass, or to inspect a granite boulder by a stream. I followed closely, determined not to lose focus. In a forest like this, you can lose your bearings in mere minutes, especially on little-known paths. But for now, the map and compass agreed, and we pressed northwest, sticking to our planned direction. The first day passed quietly. We trekked along relatively flat ground, sometimes crossing shallow streams or crawling under fallen logs. The forest teemed with life. Animal tracks crisscrossed the path, birds cried out, and the leaves rustled in the wind. We even spotted 2 deer, which quickly disappeared into a tangle of ferns. There were no unusual anomalies, and we weren't specifically searching for anything, just steadily moving toward that mysterious dot on the satellite map. Around lunchtime, I noticed a small, yawning cave opening off to the side. My friend looked up and nodded approvingly, but decided we didn't have time to explore it now. He didn't want to delay, as he hoped to reach the target area by the end of the second day. Besides, we both knew that venturing into a cave unprepared could sap our strength and time, and pose unnecessary danger. We walked another few hundred meters, and soon I spotted another dark chasm. It was likely just a crack in the hillside, yet it beckoned with its silent gloom. Still, we had a specific route to follow, so we didn't get sidetracked. In the latter part of the day, the ground began to rise and the trail grew steeper. The forest trees gave way to shrubs and moss clinging to boulders. Sometimes we had to grab onto pine roots to avoid slipping on the damp ground. By evening, we reached a shallow clearing where we set up camp. We found a relatively flat spot for the tent, and nearby flowed a small stream from which we could gather water. After settling in, I built a campfire while my friend checked the GPS devices and cross-referenced our map. As the flames danced, they illuminated the nearby tree trunks, which emerged from the darkness to create a cozy yet slightly eerie oasis of light. As dusk deepened, the forest seemed to come alive. The rustling of leaves in the wind grew more distinct, and somewhere in the distance occasional hoots echoed, perhaps from a nocturnal bird or a perched owl. In such moments it was hard to tell whether the sounds were natural or something more sinister. I knew the forest was full of life and that most creatures were nocturnal, so I didn't read too much into every rustle. Still, I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder. My friend, seemingly in high spirits, appeared utterly unafraid. He welcomed every encounter with the wild. We had a light dinner and settled into our tent, agreeing to resume our journey at the first light of dawn. The cool night air seeped in, and I shivered in my sleeping bag. Sometime past midnight, distant sounds, like someone cautiously stepping on dry branches, woke me. It might have been foxes, raccoons, or some other forest creatures. I struggled to fall back asleep, trying to convince myself that nothing was amiss. I knew only the morning light could dispel such nightmares, and I hoped the day would pass as peacefully as the night. The next morning, we set off early, breaking camp as the first hints of dawn appeared. The air was cool, and a thick fog lay over the land like a pale blanket. We walked slowly, careful not to miss anything important. I kept checking the GPS to ensure we were on track, while my friend jotted down notes about the terrain. He planned to create a detailed map of the area if he found anything worth recording. By midday, the forest began to change. Pines gradually gave way to mixed woods with oaks and maples, and the ground became rockier. The path we followed turned into an almost imperceptible animal trail, weaving between shrubs and boulders. We ventured into areas that seemed long forgotten by human footsteps. It was unlikely that any tourist groups would be here, too secluded and remote. Then we heard unexpected sounds, voices, and the crunch of branches underfoot. It seemed someone was approaching along the same trail, but from the opposite direction. We stopped and listened, and soon realized there were 3 or 4 people. When silhouettes appeared between the trees, we were surprised to see that they were 3 young guys, clearly tourists. They carried backpacks, and one had a hiking mug that jingled with every step. They noticed us and paused. The situation was almost comical. Here, in a place we hadn't expected anyone, we suddenly encountered a group of enthusiastic wanderers. I noticed they had a GPS unit and a couple of walkie-talkies. Their appearance suggested they had been on the trail for more than a day. Dusty clothes, tired yet content faces. They looked harmless and friendly, which reassured me somewhat. Although my friend usually kept his plans under wraps, he clearly felt a kinship with these young adventurers. We stopped in a small clearing to share a snack. One of them pulled out some nuts and dried fruit, while we had energy bars and a water flask. The atmosphere felt almost homely. The forest rustled around us, birds flitted by, and the lingering midday heat made a break necessary. Their group explained they were relying on satellite maps and general regional information to find scenic spots for photographs and perhaps unusual caves. I even heard them mention that the area was said to have underground lakes and ancient mountain passages, though no one knew the details. While we were snacking, my friend examined their walkie-talkies, apparently considering that staying in contact might be useful if needed. I agreed. A backup communication channel in such wild areas was a good idea. We asked about how far they planned to go and whether they had any specific objectives. It turned out they hadn't set any firm goals. They just decided to spend a few days away from civilization. Not planning any serious risks, they were generally headed toward another settlement tens of kilometers to the east. After our brief rest, it became clear that our paths were diverging. We needed to head north toward more remote mountains, while their route veered southeast. Before parting, we exchanged our walkie-talkie frequencies in case someone needed assistance. I felt a slight relief knowing that if trouble arose, we wouldn't be completely cut off from the world. At the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that such a meeting in the deep woods was a rare coincidence, one that might presage either good or bad things to come. After saying our goodbyes, I found myself looking back as they disappeared behind the trees. The forest quickly swallowed their voices and footsteps, leaving us once again in familiar silence. The sun was high now, the heat had intensified, and we decided to press on, aiming to reach our target spot by evening. I couldn't help but think about how brave or reckless those three were, while we at least had a clear goal and some knowledge of the terrain. They, on the other hand, were practically wandering by chance, relying on GPS and luck. The rest of the day passed without incident. We made good progress, sometimes climbing small rises, sometimes descending to streams. The forest grew increasingly inhospitable. Piles of fallen trees, thicker undergrowth, and a dampness emanating from rain-softened soil. Occasionally we stopped to check for cell service, but by then, there was none. I realized we were truly in the wilderness now, depending only on ourselves, each other, and if needed, those three guys on the walkie-talkies if we managed to catch them on the agreed frequency. We decided to camp on a small ridge where the ground was relatively dry. I pitched the tent, making sure it was set away from any crevasses while my friend went scouting around. He walked a bit ahead and returned, reporting that he could see an open area ahead, possibly an old logging site or a natural clearing. We agreed to reach it in the morning and decide where to set up the next camp. My legs felt tired, yet there was also a sense of exhilaration. We weren't far from the spot that had set all of this in motion. That night, as darkness fell, I lay in my tent peering through the thin fabric at the swaying silhouettes of branches, lost in thought about those three travelers. I wondered if our paths would cross again. The forest is full of surprises and sometimes traps. I hoped they would reach their destination safely. As for us, tomorrow promised the most challenging segment yet, the one that might be the gateway into the very heart of the mountains. On the third day, we emerged from the dense conifer thickets and reached a more rocky area. The day promised clear skies, and I felt relieved as sunlight finally broke through the canopy. However, the trail became increasingly rugged. The ground was littered with stones, small rock falls occurred, and the slopes grew steeper. Jake, my friend, clearly felt a surge of energy. His pace quickened, and he no longer stopped every few minutes to consult the map. It was as if some inner instinct was guiding him straight toward our goal. I did my best to keep up, though I occasionally asked him to slow down so I could catch my breath. By noon, we reached a small rocky terrace overlooking a gorge. Down below, along the riverbed, stretched a narrow band of dense forest, and we were high above it all. At the very edge, remnants of what might once have been an observation platform, or even a natural lagoon formed by time, were visible. I felt a chill standing at the windy precipice. Jake checked our coordinates and said that the spot he had seen in the images lay further up the slope, beyond the ridge. We paused briefly to regain our strength before the ascent. After another couple of kilometers along narrow, winding trails, we found ourselves in an area where the vegetation suddenly thinned. I suspected it was due to rocky scree. The trees here clung to the earth by sheer will. The air carried a mix of dampness, the scent of pine, and faint metallic notes. There was something odd about it, as if the air were being warmed by an invisible fire. I wasn't sure why I made that comparison, but suddenly a surge of unease hit me, as though we were nearing the source of some mystery. Then, as we rounded a large boulder, a sight unfolded before us that both mesmerized and frightened us. Amidst the underbrush and broken branches, a piece of fuselage jutted out, rusty and misshapen. At first glance, it was clear that this was an airplane, obviously of an old design, and it had been here for more than a year or two. It appeared we had found that very object visible in the old satellite images. Perhaps more recent images had failed to pick it up beneath a layer of vegetation. As we approached, I saw that part of the plane's skin was cloaked in a thick layer of moss, with patches of old paint, once perhaps olive, now faded to a dull green. One wing lay askew, as if torn off in a violent impact. Jake carefully examined the wreck, taking no rush to step inside. I felt a tightening in my chest, as if we were near the site of a tragedy. Looking at the wreckage, it was easy to imagine that the plane might have crashed, striking a slope or trees and breaking apart. Determining exactly when it happened would require a closer study of the details, but even from its appearance, I suspected it might date back to World War II. We had seen photographs of similar bombers or transports used by the US and its allies. We circled the main wreckage. In one spot, the ground had given way, exposing part of the tail section with a propeller, half buried in the soil. The skeletal metal frame jutted out ominously, a stark reminder of the force of impact. Jake, his hands trembling slightly, brushed away small branches and vines that had grown over the fuselage. His curiosity outweighed his fear. He believed that in places like this, one might discover something truly special, perhaps documents or artifacts that no one knew about. And then we saw them, human remains. Skeletons lay in contorted poses, clearly attesting to a catastrophic impact. Two were near the shattered pilot's cabin, and another lay beside the remnants of the front fuselage. The sight was horrifyingly real and sudden. I felt my heart clench. Jake's eyes roamed over the remains, half-rotted scraps of fabric, remnants of protective helmets. It seemed as if time had transformed these bodies into mummified skeletons draped in tattered cloth and corroded metal. I looked up and noticed something resembling a side cargo box or container lying nearby. Inside, I could make out cartridges, some of which had spilled onto the ground. It appeared that the plane had been carrying some sort of military cargo, perhaps weapons and ammunition. I picked up one cartridge and inspected it. Its caliber matched those used in World War II. All of this suggested that the plane might have been shot down or met its fate due to severe weather during a secret operation. Cautiously, we crept inside the broken fuselage. There, we found more evidence of war. Boxes of weapons, rusted rifles, disassembled machine gun parts, bundles of corroded ammunition. Some boxes lay open while others remained sealed and nailed shut. The air was damp and musty, and in the beam of our flashlight. Fragments of glass and bits of metal shimmered here and there. Jake examined the most intact boxes, noting that they might be historically valuable. Yet we lacked the equipment to safely open them. And frankly, why would we want to? Our interest was more in exploration than in looting. In one of the side compartments, we discovered the remains of a person crushed by a massive engine part. His position suggested that he wasn't the pilot, but perhaps a crew member or security detail for the cargo. It was astonishing how completely nature had reclaimed the space. Through cracks and fissures, plant roots had taken hold, and some parts of the fuselage had rusted to a powdery crumble. At times, chunks of earth and small stones tumbled from what passed for a ceiling. I felt that even a slight vibration might trigger further collapse of the structure. After spending some time inside, we concluded that we had examined the major parts of the plane. Together, we lifted the lid of one of the large boxes secured with cables. Inside lay corroded grenades wrapped in oiled fabric and various instruments whose purposes were unclear. In any case, lingering there was too dangerous. The structure could collapse at any moment. Moreover, the oppressive atmosphere of the place weighed on us. Everything around spoke of death and oblivion. When we finally emerged, the sun was already setting, and long shadows stretched across the mountainside, transforming the crash site into an even more ominous scene. I felt a strange chill deep inside as I gazed upon the mangled remains of the plane and the bodies. These were soldiers who had served decades ago, and now it seemed no one remembered them. Jake stood silently, clearly wrestling with mixed emotions. On one hand, he had found what he was searching for. On the other, the tragic scene was a stark reminder of the fragility of human life. A sudden thought flashed through my mind. Perhaps we hadn't seen everything yet. After all, the plane was large, and part of it might have been thrown aside during the crash, in an area we hadn't yet examined. We decided to set up camp at a safer distance from this dreadful site, yet close enough to return and continue exploring the area in the morning. It seemed logical. The find was significant, and military equipment of this caliber might hold even more secrets. Before bed, we spent a long time by the campfire, trying not to dwell on the horror we had witnessed earlier, though memories of the rusty wreckage and skeletal remains lingered. As I tried to distract myself, I wondered what secrets might be hidden in those boxes, and whether this crash was connected to some secret mission. Little did I know then just how deep that mystery would turn out to be. In the morning, we woke up early to take advantage of the first rays of sunlight, before the heat set in and the mountain mist descended. I felt utterly shattered. My sleep had been poor, and I kept replaying the horrifying scenes inside the airplane. Still, we couldn't leave the site without a thorough examination. Inside me, curiosity warred with my disgust at having to look at human remains again. But I knew there was no turning back. It was precisely for discoveries like these that Jake had launched this excursion, and I was determined to get to the bottom of the truth, even if it turned out to be unpleasant. We packed up the tent, gathered our backpacks, and headed back to the wreckage. The morning light revealed details we hadn't seen in the dim twilight. Chunks of metal glowed a rusty red in places, while greenish-gray moss had thickly coated the edges of the fuselage. It was as if nature were gradually digesting this alien object. Some parts had been scattered down the slope, small fragments of a wing, pieces of an engine. We decided to split up for a while to inspect different areas, but soon reconvened near the tail section. There, we noticed a massive box that clearly didn't belong to standard military equipment. The box was large and metallic, with double walls and concealed hinges. Its size rivaled that of a small cabinet. On its surface there were remnants of worn stickers and symbols that only vaguely resembled military markings. Mostly, though, there were strange signs, carvings, or runes. I had never seen anything like this on military gear before. Typically, everything was limited to alphanumeric codes and simple symbols indicating the cargo type. Here, however, there were intricate lines, as if etched beneath a layer of lacquer now partly peeling off. We tried to lift the lid, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed as though the box was either locked from the inside or had been firmly jammed by the impact. Jake ran his hand along the seams, searching for some mechanism. At one corner, we found a small metal protrusion that looked like the handle of a locked latch. We took a deep breath and, working together, tried to turn it. After a few jerks and a soft, grinding noise, the lock finally yielded. The box shuddered and the lid lifted slightly, releasing a damp, musty smell mixed with an unpleasant, almost chemical odor. I recoiled, struck by a sudden wave of nausea. It seemed something had been stored in airtight conditions inside for a long time, and now vapor from some unknown substance was escaping. Jake, pinching his nose, carefully opened the lid a little wider while I shone my flashlight inside. What we saw made me shudder unexpectedly. At the center of the box lay a strangely shaped cube covered in unknown symbols. It was encased in a frame that held it suspended, as if floating, and it emitted a faint glow, as if a battery or light source were built into it. Yet there were no wires or familiar connectors in sight. On the sides of the cube, through a layer of dust and streaks, distinct runes emerged, nothing like the scripts I was familiar with. They didn't resemble Asian hieroglyphs. Rather, the shapes of the symbols recalled ancient alchemical or occult signs, the kind you'd see in books on mysticism. Even more unsettling, the cube radiated a palpable chill, so intense that I involuntarily shivered when I brought my hand close. Jake and I exchanged glances, his eyes full of excitement mixed with bewilderment. Clearly, neither of us understood what the object before us was. It didn't look like military equipment at all. Rather, it seemed either an ancient relic or, conversely, an experimental device. The rest of the contents of the box were of little interest. Beneath lay fragments of fabric resembling heavy tarpaulin, some of it rotted and reeking of chemicals, and a few shards of glass that might have been parts of a flask or container. But the focal point was undoubtedly the glowing cube at its center. When we carefully extracted the cube, I felt a cool, tingling sensation on my fingertips, as if it were emitting a weak electric shock. I held it cautiously with both hands, expecting it might suddenly heat up or burn, but nothing of the sort happened. Along one side of the cube was a small recess filled with a hardened, dark substance that emitted a barely noticeable odor of something burnt. There was nothing military or industrial about it. Instead, it gave the impression of an object from ancient legend, an artifact perhaps best left untouched by bare hands. Jake examined the runes intently, making quick sketches in his notebook as he eagerly tried to decipher their meaning. He speculated that the object might have been transported in secret, without official markings, perhaps to avoid attention or to keep its existence hidden from enemies. I strained to recall if I'd seen anything like this in museums or books, but nothing came to mind. It resembled neither Assyrian cuneiform, Scandinavian runes, nor Slavic symbols. If it had indeed been brought in during the war from overseas, then perhaps the object held not only historical value, but also some other kind of power that people of the past believed in. We began carefully running our fingers over the surfaces of the cube, trying to detect any concealed seams or latches. At one point, Jake pressed on the side recess. It shifted slightly, and a hissing sound emerged from deep within the device, as if a locked mechanism had been released. A dull click echoed, the runes flared with a sudden brightness, and the glow intensified noticeably. For a moment it felt as if the very air around us had thickened, and a ringing buzz filled my ears, as though the cube were emitting inaudible vibrations. Suddenly the top of the cube split into small segments, forming something like petals, and from within poured a thick liquid. Its color resembled mercury, yet constantly shifted hues. Silvery sheens gave way to purples, then faded into a dark greenish murk. It looked like a living substance, one that shouldn't belong on Earth. The liquid spread across the stone, hissing as if evaporating, and it exuded a choking odor that made me instinctively recoil. Jake watched every movement intently. Deep down, I hoped it would all just be an unusual chemical reaction, but soon vague outlines of something solid began to take shape in the strange solution. Within seconds, a creature emerged in our field of vision, something resembling an animal but with a hint of human proportions. Its limbs were unnaturally elongated, and its chest jutted out with bizarre protuberances. Dull, thin hair clumped together from the sticky liquid, and the smell became unbearable. A mix of burning, decay, and something altogether unfamiliar. The creature lay on its side, curled up as if dying in agony. It was only slightly larger than a big dog, yet its twisted limbs and distorted snout betrayed it as a hybrid of a werewolf and a human. Its eyes were closed and its tongue hung limply. It was unclear whether it was alive, but its lack of movement led me to conclude that it was most likely dead. Jake couldn't resist taking a few photos on his phone, fully aware that such a discovery was sensational, if horrifying. Realizing we'd frozen in place over that ominous corpse, I felt panic-induced trembling in my knees. The stench had grown so sharp that it took my breath away. Fearing toxic fumes, I suggested we move to a safe distance. Jake nodded, and we clambered away from under the wing of the wreckage, careful to keep our distance from both the foul liquid and the body of the creature seemingly spawned from the mysterious depths of the cube. Outside, the air was cold, but infinitely more tolerable than that nightmarish aroma inside. Leaving the cube and its ghastly contents behind, we felt fear grip our minds. I couldn't shake the thought that we had triggered a process whose nature we had no inkling of. I wanted nothing more than to flee this mountain region, yet curiosity and a sense of duty compelled us to stay. We decided to survey the area, make sure there were no immediate dangers nearby, and try to understand what secret our careless actions had unleashed. About 20 minutes later, we returned to the wreckage, intending to check on the body of the strange beast in the cube itself. But we were met with a new shock. When we entered the half-ruined fuselage, there were no traces of the creature, not a hint of the sticky substance that had flowed from the cube. Only minor smudges remained on the stone, as if someone had erased everything, or time itself had acted like an invisible sponge. The cube, too, had changed. Its faces had closed back up, and the strange runes glowed dimly through a layer of moss and grime. No sounds emanated from within, even though during our initial inspection we had clearly heard hissing and a low hum. This was unsettling because the disappearance of the corpse suggested that either the creature wasn't as dead as it seemed, or someone else had been here before us and taken it away. Either possibility made our hearts pound faster. We hesitated, unsure whether to stay near the plane or move farther away, when suddenly we noticed several overturned boxes on the ground where cartridges had once been stored. They lay toppled and dented, as if someone had rifled through them searching for something important. This had happened after we'd left, meaning an unknown visitor had been here overnight. We quickly gathered our things, realizing that lingering any longer was too dangerous. It was best to leave these wrecks behind and try to escape the forest. Something inexplicable was unfolding all around us. A couple of kilometers away, we stumbled upon a clearing where droplets of a dark liquid, resembling a mixture of blood and something sticky, glimmered on the ground. The trails led deep into the undergrowth, leaving thick, reddish-brown stains on the grass and debris. In some spots, patches of fur or hair lay scattered that looked nothing like those of ordinary forest animals. I tried to find a rational explanation, but my mind immediately conjured images of a night-stalking monster. Here and there on the trees were crude gouges, as if made by a rough tool or sharp claws, slanted marks intersecting at strange angles. They resembled primitive symbols or markings left for someone. Looking at them, a chill of fear ran down my spine. It became increasingly clear that we were not alone. Someone, or something, was indeed watching us, and pretending it was mere coincidence was futile. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the greater our anxiety grew. Along the way, we increasingly noticed broken branches, bloody stains, and deep scratches on the bark. Finally, Jake suggested we stop to catch our breath and plan an escape route. We realized that the usual tourist or hunter paths wouldn't do. They only led to impenetrable thickets. And there was the risk that the mysterious monster or a group of unknown creatures was already crossing our path. We eventually set up camp on a small rise, hastily assembling our gear without much comfort. The sleep that followed was restless. I spent nearly all night hearing indistinct, rustling, creaking branches and distant groans, as if something was moving nearby. It felt as though a dense shroud of darkness had wrapped around us, offering no relief even for a few hours. By dawn, a mist had enshrouded the trees, giving everything an eerie, ghostly appearance. When we woke and went out to scout the area, the first thing we encountered was the body of a deer lying right before our camp. The sight was shocking. The mutilated carcass appeared arranged in a bizarre pattern, as if serving as a ritualistic symbol. Bones and innards were exposed in such a way that it couldn't have been a simple animal attack. I felt a wave of nausea, and Jake froze, unable to tear his eyes away. We knew then that we had to leave as soon as possible. Something was clearly marking its territory, suggesting that any intrusion by uninvited guests would end in disaster. The deer's corpse reeked of a sharp, almost chemical odor reminiscent of the stench from the crashed fuselage. The connection between these events was becoming all too obvious, and it only deepened my fear. During the day, we managed to reach a less dense part of the forest where we could quicken our pace. Branches snagged on our backpacks less often, and the ground was firmer. We pressed on without stopping, hoping to distance ourselves from any potential pursuit. But as evening approached and the sun nearly set, a piercing scream suddenly tore through the silence. It wasn't the roar of an animal, nor did it sound entirely human. My heart pounded in terror. The scream was laden with agony, as if the creature were experiencing unbearable pain or rage. Moments later, a trembling voice came through on the radio, pleading for help. Memories of the 3 tourists we'd encountered days earlier flashed in our minds. In a panic, we raced toward the sound, hoping we could save someone from impending doom. As we drew near in the deepening dusk, we recognized familiar faces. Sarah and Tom, a couple from that group. They looked horrified, clothes torn, faces smeared with dirt, eyes reflecting pure panic and exhaustion. Their third companion, John, was nowhere to be seen, immediately conjuring grim thoughts. Barely able to stand, Sarah pointed toward the depths of the undergrowth where, according to them, a monster had suddenly appeared. Something resembling a huge beast with a terrifying snout. Judging by their description, it could very well have been the same creature we had seen emerging near the plain, only much larger and stronger. The terror in their eyes made it clear they had witnessed a nightmare. Tom clutched a bloodied arm, barely holding on to consciousness. It turned out that John hadn't managed to escape. The beast had grabbed him and dragged him into the darkness, leaving only desperate cries for help over the radio. Realizing the situation was dire, we knew we had to band together and try to break free from this doomed place before the monster returned for more victims. We all understood that here, we either acted as one or perished. Even in the encroaching darkness, the urgency to leave immediately was palpable. For night was coming, and with it, countless new horrors. The sinister forest seemed to close in around us like living walls, offering no chance for peaceful rest. Soon after meeting Sarah and Tom, we tried to find a safe spot, but everything looked equally bleak and dangerous. A thick gloom enveloped the trees, and even the moon, if it managed to pierce through the canopy, offered little light. Eventually, we came upon a small body of water and decided to set up camp nearby for the night, hoping to regain some strength. The entire group was on high alert. Everyone jumped at the slightest sound. The next morning, nature delivered its grim surprise. Just a few meters from our camp, we discovered a human body. Approaching it, we identified it as the third member of the tourist group, the very John that the beast had dragged into the darkness. The body was so horribly mutilated that it was almost unbearable to look at. Deep, ragged wounds, exposed innards, all surrounded by claw marks that cut into the thicket. It gave the impression that the monster had deliberately returned its victim as a ghastly warning. Sarah burst into tears while Tom turned away, unable to face the sight. Jake and I were filled with a chilling terror. It was as if the creature were demonstrating its power, toying with us like a cat playing with a mouse. We couldn't afford to linger another second. Heading to the nearest town would mean a long journey through untraveled paths, where we'd be easy prey for the creature. The only somewhat reasonable idea that came to mind was to return to the wreckage of the plane, where we'd seen military boxes containing ammunition and weapons. Perhaps we could rig some kind of defense. It was unlikely that the old equipment would be in perfect condition, but we had no other choice. If the monster had decided to hunt us, we needed to at least fight back. Despite being shaken, Tom and Sarah agreed to join us. Together, the four of us had a better chance of survival. Our path took us through familiar, dense forest where the trail was barely discernible. We stumbled over roots that seemed like traps or sank our feet into rotting leaves. With every step, the forest felt increasingly hostile. Not even birds sang here. A sticky, oppressive silence reigned, broken only by occasional rustles that made our hearts skip a beat. We saw no direct signs of pursuit, yet we all knew we were being watched. After several hours, we reached the very ridge behind which the plane's wreckage lay hidden. In the leaden light of an overcast sky, the gnarled peaks loomed menacingly, like steel teeth of an ancient predator. As we climbed over the scree, the tension mounted. Each of us knew that near the military boxes, we'd eventually have to decide whether to fight or flee. I silently prayed that the weapons would at least function a little and that the beast wouldn't catch up to us prematurely. Around us, not a sound of wind or rustle of bird wings could be heard, and the silence of the forest felt like an omen of something dreadful. We had to act quickly before fear completely paralyzed us. We finally reached the wrecked plane as evening fell. The sky was overcast with thick gray clouds, and occasional rays of sunlight broke through the heavy veil. The wreckage looked even more grim than when we'd first seen it. Every panel of the fuselage seemed to be coated with an extra layer of rust, and the sections of the wing jutting out of the ground resembled deformed obelisks erected in memory of a long-forgotten war. The air reeked of damp metal and stale moisture, evoking memories of past tragedies. Without wasting time inspecting the interior, we immediately rushed to the boxes with ammunition we'd noted earlier. Some had been broken into, apparently by that unknown nocturnal guest, but the remaining ones were relatively intact. With great effort, we pried off the rusted lids and found inside old boxes of cartridges and several partially disassembled rifles. The metal was coated with a patina, and the grease had long dried up, yet parts of the weapons still suggested they could fire if handled carefully. We inspected every component, trying to coax them back to life after decades of dormancy. An oily residue at the bottom of one of the boxes turned out to be the key. It helped us clean the mechanisms just enough. While we worked on the gear, Sarah and Tom scouted the area around the plane, determined to ensure there were no traces of the beast nearby. When they returned, however, they brought grim news. On the branches of nearby trees, there were fresh strips of bark torn away by sharp claws, and on one boulder lay a puddle of dark liquid. Everything pointed to the creature's proximity and suggested it was watching our every move. A shiver of dread ran down my spine at the thought that we were trying to hide from our own shadows. Any moment now the predator might strike, using its speed and strength. Realizing that a simple defense wouldn't suffice, Jake proposed setting a trap. He recalled that fragments of explosive devices had been left inside the cabin, possibly grenades or even mines crushed in the crash. If we could combine them with the fuel remnants in the plane's tanks, we might trigger a powerful explosion that would obliterate everything around us. We knew this step was extremely dangerous. Old explosives could detonate unpredictably and kill us. But our options were dwindling. The werewolf, or whatever it was, clearly had no intention of letting us live. Gathering our courage, we split up. Jake and I ventured into the central part of the fuselage where the cargo hold had once been. Amid the rusted ribs of the frame, hanging tarpaulin strips and remnants of metal crates could still be seen. As we searched for any sign of ammunition, we felt out several cylindrical objects that vaguely resembled grenades, though their markings were worn off. Some were crushed, others appeared relatively intact. Aware of the risk, we carefully gathered them near the exit so that we could quickly remove them if necessary. Next, we set out to locate a fuel tank. It appeared that one of the reservoirs had survived the crash without exploding, thanks to a favorable angle of impact. Although partially deformed, something was still sloshing inside. We fashioned a makeshift fuse using remnants of fuel-soaked rags and arranged it so that when ignited, a chain reaction would ensue. The key was to lure the creature into this metal trap, or at least get it close enough so that the explosion could engulf it. The idea was suicidal, but we had no other choice. While we were busy preparing, Tom and Sarah outside were straining to catch every sound. At one point, they signaled that they could hear heavy breathing coming from beneath the tail section of the plane. My heart leapt to my throat. If the monster was already here, we had almost no time left to perfect our plan. In a feverish rush, Jake secured the bundle of grenades by the entrance while I searched for a way to extend the fuse outside so that, when the time came, I could ignite it from a safe distance. Everything inside the wreckage creaked and threatened to collapse, as if waiting for the slightest vibration. Then suddenly a soul-chilling roar erupted from outside. Sarah shrieked, and from the tone of her cry it was clear she was witnessing something horrifying. We realized the werewolf had come out into the open. Grabbing only the essentials, we bolted from the fuselage. Before us unfolded a terrifying scene. At the very edge of the trees stood that same creature which had once emerged from the cube. Now it looked much larger and taller than when it had been born. Its hideous, distorted body was covered in shaggy mottled fur, with bones jutting out in grotesque lumps. Thick foam dripped from its maw, and its eyes glowed with a grim crimson light. It seemed to have swollen with wild energy, as if some alien substance had spurred its growth. In that moment, everything around us seemed to freeze. Tom clutched his rifle to his chest, trying to aim despite his trembling hands. I grabbed a cartridge for a test shot, but the rusty bolt jammed at the last moment. The creature emitted a long, rasping growl, and its sudden movement resembled the leap of a wild beast. We retreated toward the fuselage's entrance, trying to lure the monster closer to our planted explosives. My mouth went dry, but survival instinct compelled me to continue. When the werewolf reached the wreckage, Jake, gritting his teeth, ignited the fuse. Flames raced unevenly along the rag, sparking erratically. The creature reacted to the moving fire and lunged forward, its claws biting into the metal frame. At the last moment, we ducked behind a corner, and after a few agonizing seconds, an explosion thundered forth. A resounding echo that spread throughout the valley, sending fountains of twisted metal and burning debris flying. The ground shook, and the sky was shrouded in coal-black smoke. In the ensuing chaos, it was impossible to tell if we had struck the monster. Smoke blinded us, and hot gusts of wind burned our skin. I dashed from behind the remains of the plane, catching sight of something dark lurching away. It seemed that the beast hadn't perished under the wreckage after all. Its silhouette flickered among the trees, and its furious roar faded into the distance, dissolving into the howling wind. We were exhausted, burned, and dazed from the explosion, yet we knew it was time to run. Flames were devouring the remnants of the fuselage, transforming the metal skeleton of the plane into a blazing inferno. Understanding that we couldn't afford a long break, we plunged deeper into the forest in search of safer ground. Every step was a struggle. Echoes of the explosion reverberated around us, and the heavy smell of burning was a constant reminder that our trap hadn't done its job. The creature had survived and could return at any moment. The burning flames lit up the night sky with a reddish glow as we raced along deep ravines and fallen trees, desperate to escape the danger we had unwittingly unleashed. A paralyzing fear gripped our hearts as we realized that the werewolf was not dead, only lying in wait. Our lives now depended on speed and luck. Here in these mountain forests we had no support and no certainty of rescue. We ran as if by instinct, groping our way through thorny undergrowth, ravines, and streams until, after nearly a day, we emerged onto a hunting trail that led us to the outskirts of the nearest town. We were nearly spent, our clothes were torn, and our minds were muddled, but our main priority was to find people and report what had happened. When we reached the rescue service and local police, our account of the crashed plane, the werewolf, and the horrifying discoveries in the mountains was met with obvious skepticism. Nevertheless, the authorities dispatched a patrol unit and rescuers to investigate our claims. We never learned exactly what they found at the crash site, whether they reported traces of the explosion, recovered remnants of the cube, or found any remains of the monster. Soon after, we were released, and the subsequent events slipped from our grasp. Later, when we tried to follow up on the investigation, we discovered that all information regarding that area had been unexpectedly classified. All that remained were vague memories, too horrifying to contemplate in sleep, and the unsettling notion of how dangerous the secrets lurking deep within wild forests can be. Since then, the feeling has haunted us that the story is not over, that somewhere beyond the line of trees, a dark fragment of another world might still be alive.